Hello, good to have your company. Now, what links Mercedes Benz, the NBA, and the world's most valuable company, Apple? Well, they've all had to back down recently for fear of offending China. So is Chinese censorship affecting freedom of speech far beyond its borders? You're watching Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. China has shown that it's going to come down very hard indeed whenever it sees interference in what it calls its internal affairs. The Hong Kong protests, Tibet, even the treatment of Uyghur Muslims. But when companies retract statements, remove offending adverts, or take down services apparently to appease Beijing, the concern is that Chinese censorship is becoming a global export.
It took just one tweet from the manager of the US basketball team Houston Rockets expressing support for the protests in Hong Kong. The result? The NBA was blacklisted by the Chinese government, broadcasts of their games cancelled, all sponsorship and licensing agreements with Chinese companies suspended. According to Chinese officials, the post hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. For the NBA, it was very bad for business. Basketball is China's most popular sport, with more than 640 million people there having watched the 2017 to 2018 NBA season. Foreign businesses in China have long recognized the red lines that must not be crossed. These taboo topics are often described as the 3 Ts: Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. But they've now been joined by newer issues such as the protests in Hong Kong and the mass imprisonment of China's Muslim minority. The price to pay for access to the largest consumer market in the world is playing by China's rules. Last month, Apple deleted an app called HKmap.live, which allowed Hong Kong protesters to track police movements, and gaming company Activision had suspended a professional gamer for saying "Liberate Hong Kong" during a broadcast. With China's growing economic influence and rising international profile, will multinational companies continue to bow to Chinese government pressure for the sake of profits? And when it comes to dealing with China, does freedom of expression have a limit and a price?
Let's get talking. We go to Beijing first of all. Einar Tangen is there, political economics commentator. To Hong Kong now, we meet Amon Yiu Yeuk-wa, a member of the Demosisto activist group and a researcher in international relations. With me at the round table, Sophie Wushuang Yi, PhD student at the Lau China Institute, King's College, London, and Dr. Chen, assistant professor in Chinese law at the Durham Law School. Great to have you all along. Einar, let me come to you first of all. This is a form of intimidation. Let me go through the companies: Audi, Cathay Pacific, Disney, Delta Airlines, the Marriott, Swarovski, Versace, Gap. It goes on and on. This is pure intimidation, isn't it?
Well, that might be the way you want to interpret it, but, you didn't include Google as well, and there are a lot of other companies. The issue here is that when you go to another country, you have to obey their rules. And, if I wanted to do a listing in the United States at the New York Stock Exchange, I have to follow the SEC rules, whether I agree with them or not. It's simply the lie of the land. But in China's particular case, they feel a little bit under attack at the moment between all the arms sales to Taiwan, the interference what they see in Hong Kong, comments on their Xinjiang issues, things like this, and this kind of idea that they're being encircled, and every time they try to change something like the Belt and Road Initiative to kind of reach out, they're called, basically lots of bad things: thieves and intellectual property stealers and things like this. So at this point, what they have is the market. And they want to have a market that almost every company, all the ones you mentioned, want to be part of. Now, when things don't go well, when they feel that they're being attacked, they say, "You're not welcome here." And that is not something that is unique to China, all right? And it's not unique to the US. They've done the same thing, both with Japan and South Korea. So it's their big stick, and it's the one they use to say you're crossing the line. So from their
Can I just bring in Amon at this particular point? We'll get back to the United States in just a moment. But Amon, the point that Amon makes here is that this is simple common sense. If you want to play by play in somebody's particular country, you have to play by their rules.
But I would say the Chinese style censorship is a little bit different because they are not just monitoring on the corporate level. In the past, they may be monitoring the official websites as well as some promotion materials to see whether they comply with the CCP narratives. But right here, what we see recently, they try to extend their reach to more personal level. Just a tweet on your personal personal social media account, it will be subject to some kind of political censorship. So I would say that is a worrying sign for Western world because lots of our employees, maybe their companies do business in China, but they have to be personally applying to all sets of rules in China. That's not healthy, I think.
Okay, Dr. Ge, you study
That's an
law.
assertion that
I'll come back to you. I promise I will come back to you. Dr. Chen, Ge, this is the Internet Law, Article 5 of 1997, a whole list of incitements, etc., making falsehoods, promoting feudal superstitions, but this is the one that gets to me. And other activities against the Constitution, laws or administrative regulations. Basically, it is whatever the Chinese government feels offended by.
Right. So China's censorship regime is actually all-encompassing. So in a bunch of other laws and regulations, the Chinese government not only lists those acts against the law, the Constitution, but also all the other activities that the government is not fond of. And this kind of rules obtained not only in this internet law, which was now, which dated back to almost 20 or 30 years ago, it actually it exists in all the other relevant laws and regulations.
Did it used to merely apply to Chinese citizens, or mostly, but now it's expanded to a global audience because of what in particular?
That's true, partly. But I want to refer to some historical development here, of course, because if you say the Chinese government is exporting a kind of censorship regime, then that's a tradition that could be actually dated back to the end of the 19th century. After the Japanese War, the emperor of the Qing dynasty at that time initiated a series of negotiations with Western powers, of which there was an important chip, so to speak, that is to allow American publishers to publish their works in China and give those publishers copyright protection. However, in return, the US government must support the Qing government at that time to conduct censorship regime over...
You must have done comparisons with other countries, and I'm sure China's not alone in this.
No, but of course, but Chinese government is also is doing this recently because of some political sensitive issues, of course.
And we'll get into the Uyghur Muslims in the West. We'll get on to the Hong Kong protests in just a moment. But Sophie, I wanted to bring you in here. We're suggesting that this isn't new, but is it accelerating?
Well, I am a Chinese citizen myself. So from my perspective, because I can observe what happens in the West and also what happens in China. And a lot of the times, especially in the case of NBA, when
this is the National Basketball Association
yes,
in the United States. Yeah.
When people in the West accusing the Chinese government have been banned, the NBA being banned in China, people are still attending those public games in China.
But the suggestion from the Chinese government was that the Chinese people felt offended by this one tweet from an NBA official talking about the protests in Hong Kong. And they reckon there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of basketball supporters who probably wouldn't then go to basketball games featuring Americans or whatever. Are the Chinese people themselves sensitive about this, or is it just a state thing?
The Chinese people are definitely sensitive about this kind of issue because it is regarded to the sovereignty and integrity of the People's Republic of China, which they are part of. And I think we should not only focus on the fact that how these foreign companies have been treated in China, but also how the consumers are actually reacting to this kind of incidents. And the fact that the people are still choose to show up in those games in China definitely shows that they can express their opinions to love the country, but also they can also express their opinion of supporting.
But they were all handed Chinese flags to show their support for the Chinese government. It wasn't an outpouring of instant emotion.
Yeah, but I think that is a perfect example of freedom of expression in China.
Well, let's get on to that. Emma, let me bring this up with you. We're talking about freedom of speech here. Why shouldn't Audi be able to say what it likes? Why shouldn't the NBA be able to say what it likes? It is, after all, only criticism. It doesn't affect the value of a product or perhaps how it's going to sell.
We are thinking because China is actually using the markets to asking the foreign companies to comply with their set of rules. For example, they will use a lot of state-run media to mobilize people to boycott the NBA on the stage level. So, and that one is problematic. And we're not just considering some personal freedoms, we are considering the stage action.
This is simply about freedom of speech, isn't it? Why shouldn't people be able to say what they want? They can in America. It's the First Amendment, 1791.
Yes, and that's why it's a different country. Quite frankly, the Chinese consumers were upset by things that were said by Italian fashion companies, Gucci, et cetera, et cetera. So they boycotted. And this was not something that the government was directing. Around the world, you're seeing a rise of nationalism. You see it in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. You saw it with Brexit as people reacted against what they saw as undesirable aliens invading their land. You have this kind of happening around the world. For China, emerging from its past, this 100 years of humiliation, this is something very real. It's not something that people in the West think too much about.
But China's terrified of criticism. This is the problem, isn't it? What's happening with the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province in the west of the country. Articles in Haaretz from a woman who says she escaped from a gulag there. 20 prisoners in a small room, a bucket in the corner for their toilet, learning Chinese, memorizing propaganda songs, confessing to invented sins. This is partly what it's about. China does not want the world to see what it's doing inside its own country.
Well, quite frankly, from their perspective, they see this as an internal matter. And it's one of those issues which, whether you agree with it or not, these things go on. I mean, I can name all sorts of countries where there are concerns about freedom of rights and things like that.
But I'm going to go now to Gerhard, to Dr. Chen, and to talk about the physical realities. Sophie, you want to make a comment on this one? The physical realities of China. Because we're talking about Xinjiang province in the west with the Uyghur Muslims. We're talking about Tibet. That is a border that China wants to protect at all costs. Otherwise, it fears perhaps an attack from India. Then you come to the east. You've got Taiwan. You've got Hong Kong. You've got the sea areas there. This is not so much, not entirely about internal criticism and being oversensitive. It's a physical reality that China's worried about losing control of these areas.
Right. So actually, every country has its own definition of sovereignty. And China assumes kind of sovereignty over practically almost everything, even including those things that people think are now being channeled into a globalized issue. So these questions are actually in the very core of the Chinese government's
And this is why they are oversensitive, in some people's opinion, to criticism?
They are. So that is why we see that there is practically no discussion in any Chinese forums. That is true.
And then they're worried that people outside start to talk about these things and what might happen.
Well, practically it is a kind of tradition of the government to keep things under control, everything, including the debates, the discussions of public interests, of public order issues under control. So,
because they're concerned, though, this is my question, because they're concerned that what might happen from outside? Separatist movements, protest movements like the ones in Hong Kong, there could be uprisings?
they're
with
afraid
outside
of
interference?
infiltrations, ideological infiltrations, as the party calls it. So we see from the most important session of the party's Congress about 2 or 3 weeks ago, just last month, the Chinese Communist Party is now trying to put forward a new program, which is called Modernizing the Governance System. So under that system, it will tighten not only the political control, the economic control, but also the ideological ones. So the government will definitely decline any Western-style democracy.
And that includes open criticism. Sophie, I want to ask you, please tell me if this is too sensitive, but you're a student in London, but you're a Chinese citizen.
Yes.
And you went to school in China, in Beijing, was it?
Well, in Guangzhou.
Okay,
Yeah.
in Guangzhou. What were you led to believe was the reason for outside criticism of China?
I think a lot of the times when, as you just mentioned, and also mentioned that the victimhood sentiments, a lot of the times when the West think about China is always the threats imposed by China upon the West, but not what are the threats that has been perceived by China.
And do you believe that to be the case? Is that what you were taught, that there are real threats to China and therefore it will not tolerate criticism?
There are a lot of threats to a lot of different countries in the world. And
I'm talking
especially-
specifically about China. You're a Chinese citizen, you went to school there.
There are a lot of threats. Definitely a lot of threats, especially when China is under this kind of Sino-US great power competition.
Do you think it suits the state's purposes to portray China still as a victim? Difficult one. I'll let you think about that.
Yes, thank you.
Amon, sorry we had to interrupt you. Yeah, Emma, yeah, you go first. Mr. Tangen.
Yes. You're kind of switching things around. Listen, I mean, she's talking about how she feels. She's a student. She tried to express to you this kind of pride in the sense. Now, when you want to talk about victimization, let's go back to 100 years of humiliation. Why is Hong Kong not part of China? Because it was taken in a drug war by the Brits. In 1842, they sailed in with their gunboats, took the land, they sailed up the sea, and they basically forced at gunpoint a series of treaties where they could hold Hong Kong, Macau, and other concessions. So yes, that is remembered. You know, it's easy to sit back and say, oh gosh, you're portraying yourself as a victimization. But remember, during those period of time, the thoughts that came in from the outside were both good and bad. Right? There wasn't all bad. There was they liked Karl Marx. They obviously followed along that line. But there are other parts of it which were not so pleasant. All right, and that was the wholesale, having the right to sell opium in China is, perhaps something that we should think about.
But what about today? Okay, that's the history. That's your idea of the context for it. What about today? Where's China a victim today?
China's a victim, let's say, arms sales to Taiwan. That's just the way they see it. They see House of Representatives, senior American officials expressing support, as well as in Britain, expressing support for what the Chinese see as a bunch of terrorists, people who are harming others, using literally terrorist tactics to force everyone else in Hong Kong to agree with their ideas. They're not elected. They're not about the rule of law. All right, China was trying to figure out a way to do this backdoor where they have the Belt and Road Initiative. Now that's constantly...
This is the massive expansion of Chinese trade taking in sea routes, just for everybody else's benefit. This is the expansion of Chinese trade, the Silk and Belt and Road Initiative, through the sea routes, eventually ending up on the east coast of Africa.
And land routes.
And land routes, yes, of course.
And the whole point... Yeah, and the whole point about this was they did not want to be bottled up in the seas around there, because you had South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, Guam, this kind of string of pearls, which were U.S. bases, naval and Air Force, which they felt could lead to a blockade. Remember, China is particularly sensitive because they're ranked near the bottom 100 of countries in resources per person. They must have resources from outside. They're dependent on that. And they're dependent on the markets that they add value to these resources and then try to sell.
Okay,
so
I'm going to go to Amon because we have to give everybody a shout here. Amon, where do you think this leaves us? In commercial terms, China's economy is expanding all the time, and these companies, Apple, et cetera, want to do business there. Does that make them craven, beholden? And in terms of the outside debate about China, where does this censorship, if you like to call it that, leave us?
I would say that kind of victimization actually happens quite recently because when we see after just the early to the 21st century, they have a more friendly relationship with the Western world. But after 2008, they started to promote some sort of rise of China to have more aggressive and progressive role play in the global. So that I would say that kind of victimization intensified recent years.
Okay, let's bring the studio discussion around to this idea of other companies, perhaps governments, doesn't matter whether it's commercial or whether it's political, being craven to the Chinese government because they feel they need them so much for their capitalist ideas, their expansion, etc. Where does this leave us?
Well, actually, all Western companies want to enter into the Chinese market, we see, and they are more or less reluctant in the beginning to follow the censorship. However, then they get accustomed to it. That is probably also because international law itself cannot do anything about this. So in the China-US intellectual property dispute in 2009, we see that the Chinese government is able to defend its censorship regime under its allegedly infringing copyright law because, as it argues, and as the WTO panel so affirms, that the international trade law, including the Berne Convention, allows member states to carry out censorship just in certain sense, so that...
But is it censorship to say, if you continue saying what you're saying, we will stop you doing business here? Isn't that restraint of trade?
That is partly because within this regime of laws, the Chinese government has learned how to weaponize its market to silence those companies and those multinational corporations.
Okay. Sophie, I gave you a chance to think about it. You may find it rather awkward to say what I asked you, which was about the role of the state here. But where do you think this is going to leave China? As the dominant global power, as long as it keeps stifling criticism? Where do you think it's going?
I think China's hands is tied because, well, from the contemporary history, well, if I can draw on the 1999 Belgrade bombing of the Chinese embassy, well, there is no military response to that event, and that is why China, and also according to the 1950 non-interference policy, China is not intended to interfere with other countries' internal affairs. That is why we have the Chinese.
But other things we're talking about purely internal affairs, which China's been trotting out for a very long time, for almost everything, every time it's criticised. Are these internal affairs, or are these affairs for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world should be worried about what is censorship?
Well, it is not in. I think it is not in the interest of China to politicalize or globalize or internationalize its internal affairs, and because at this stage, a business-like relations for China with the other actors would be more beneficial.
Okay. Einar, just a quick final word, Mr. Tangen, to you. Is this going to stop? Will China tolerate any criticism, interference, or is it just going to carry on?
Hopefully in the future, China will believe in its own success story and that this will be ameliorated. But as long as they feel that they're under attack by mostly the international press and the great powers like Europe and the United States, they will continue to use what they have. They only have one big weapon, and that is access to the market. So yes, that will continue as it does continue in other areas.
And a final thought from Amon this time, the Hong Kong protests. Do the people there feel slightly abandoned because of the way that other companies see their vested interests in China and know that they cannot afford to upset China?
I would say I still have hope but in the past, only the foreign company, they have to fight alone. they do not have much support from their government. So I think it's very important for all world leaders to have to lay down some baseline for China. They cannot pass through all these baseline, especially for the basic human rights and all expression freedoms. So
Okay.
I think it's very important for the government to speak out.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much indeed. I'm glad we've got all of this out in the open. But I suppose one of the suggestions is that while Western governments may say certain things about what's happening in Hong Kong, they may well be empty words because they know they still have to do business with China, going to be the biggest economy in the world at some point. And the companies that we've mentioned here also know exactly the same. It is the reality of the world. You make something, you've got to sell it, you've got to abide by the rules, whether you regard those rules as fair or not. Thank you very much indeed for coming in the studio. Thank you for joining us from Beijing and from Hong Kong. And thank you very much indeed for watching. We hope to have your company next time. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now.